Sorry, just to let you know, we're waiting for Jeremy Corbyn, who'll be here any moment. Where is he? Is he here? Is he hiding? Jeremy, if you're sitting down there as you used to, please come up. Hall, and hello everybody watching at home on the Facebook live stream, whether it's on a computer, TV, or on your phone. And welcome to what is a celebration of the life of Harry Leslie Smith, somebody we all knew, we admired, we respected, we were inspired by and loved. He was a remarkable man who wanted to fight social injustice, and as his body got weaker, his spirit grew stronger. He is, alas, no longer with us, but his spirit lives on, and we can continue to take inspiration from him. And I've spoken to John, his son. Yes, we're remembering Harry. Yes, his death was very sad, but he was always a life force, and he would want you to remember him with applause, with cheers, with laughter, and cry if you want to. So it might be a memorial, but there's no need to be silent, and we can make this a fun night, which sounds odd when we're remembering somebody, but that was the man who Harry was. Born in poverty, he knew the Great Depression. His sister died when there was no NHS. He fought in the RAF, and late in life, he campaigned for social justice. He wanted a better world for future generations, and we can live on and try and make his dream a reality. If you're using social media, please use the hashtag #IStandWithHarry, always a good place to be. And we're going to kick off this evening. We're going to start with, we've got a fantastic harpist here, Allegra, who's been playing for you. I'd ask you to stand and sing, and the words are on your sheets on the chairs. One of Harry's favorites, Danny Boy.
And all the grave
Thank you, Allegra. I think Harry would have enjoyed that singing. He might have been laughing at it as well. All right. As we remember Revel, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers tonight. In the middle, we have some films. At the end, we'll finish with a red flag and on Ilkley Murbach. And our first speaker this evening is a journalist, a radical journalist, a fighter for social justice who knew Harry very well. And I think you know the journalist. It is Owen Jones. Thank you.
The struggle for progress, for social justice, for equality, for liberation is a collective struggle. But that doesn't mean that individuals cannot make exceptional contributions to that struggle by inspiring and encouraging others, by using their voice to challenge the injustices that don't just scar our society, but define it. Harry Leslie Smith was one such man who made an exceptional contribution. I was lucky enough to meet Harry back in 2014. I must admit I was starstruck. He had just delivered a barnstorming speech to Labour Party conference about the misery of benefit cuts and austerity and the threat to our National Health Service. It included that memorable line which brought the house down, "Mr. Cameron, keep your mitts off my NHS." When he spoke of the misery, the pain, the poverty he endured growing up in interwar Yorkshire, he reduced many of the delegates and beyond to tears. A few months later, we both spoke at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford alongside Melissa Benn. Much of the audience were literally generations younger than Harry. As they listened to that sing-song voice of his, talking of the hardship and squalor of his youth, they were spellbound. Harry inspired and encouraged younger people to not be resigned to injustice, not to treat it as an act of God or like the weather, but instead to fight it. Tony Benn always said that the way you get change is through the burning flame of anger at injustice and the burning flame of hope for a better world. Harry was someone who carried both of those flames. He was a messenger carrying a warning, a reminder that all the rights and freedoms we have today were not given to us as acts of generosity by the powerful, but won through the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. And that if we don't always fight to defend those rights and those freedoms, those with power and with wealth will try to steal them away. But he also offered hope too, that with enough determination, resilience and solidarity, we can overcome injustice and build a better world. For both these messages, Harry drew on his own history. When he was a 3-year-old, and we'll hear much, I'm sure, about this, his elder sister Marion died of tuberculosis in a workhouse 2 decades before the first majority Labour government founded the NHS. Too poor to afford a funeral, his family buried her in an unmarked pauper's grave. It is a grim fact that 4,000 such paupers' funerals happen each year today in 21st century Britain. Harry grew up in a world without a welfare state. And as he saw a Tory-led government force low-paid workers and disabled people to pay for a crisis caused by the banks, by the elites, he was determined to warn a new generation of a return to the evils and injustices that him and his family had endured. He had another warning too. Harry lived through the most catastrophic war of human history, one which took the lives of tens of millions in unparalleled barbarity. Harry signed up to the Royal Air Force as a wireless operator and crossed into Belgium, then the Netherlands, and finally Germany. He saw the refugees fleeing the horrors of war. When he first marched into the ruins of Hamburg, he recalls that the stench of death was just unbelievable. Harry had 2 warnings from this period of violence, destruction, and death. One was about how the Nazis had demonized and vilified Jewish people, culminating in the attempted physical extermination of all European Jews. Harry was a passionate fighter against all forms of racism, of xenophobia, and bigotry. The revival of the far right across the US and Europe horrified him because he had witnessed the misery and destruction inflicted by fascism. It drove his passion to defend refugees, Muslims and migrants, who media and political elites have attempted to scapegoat and blame for all the injustices caused by the powerful. This is what fascism looks like in 2018, and it always reeks of Islamophobia, he declared, when Boris Johnson used his newspaper column to whip up anti-Muslim bigotry. He took up the cause of refugees, making repeated visits to the Calais refugee camp. I have seen camps like the jungle before at the end of the war, he wrote, but back then there was a desire amongst ordinary citizens and their leaders to alleviate the plight of refugees. Today, it is different. He was a proud ally of LGBTQ people, denouncing Theresa May's alliance with the DUP as aiding and abetting homophobia. His other lesson from that period of barbarism was the desperate need to fight for peace and to stop the senseless mass murder inherent in war. He used his voice to speak out against the Saudi-led onslaught against Yemen, made possible by British weapons and the British government's support. Yemeni children today slaughtered in school buses, and Yemen enveloped in the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. Last October, he wrote, "Considering that 13 million are at risk of annihilation from a famine in Yemen that was created by the politics of Theresa May, Trump, and others who sold and sell arms to Saudi Arabia, this should be leading news stories, not some royal baby announcement." But Harry Leslie Smith did not simply offer warnings, he offered hope. As millions of soldiers waited to be demobilised, Harry recalled jubilation, dancing and drinking when Clement Attlee's Labour Party won a landslide victory in 1945, with his comrades inspired by commitments to create a national health service and build decent, affordable housing. That was a transformative government that established the NHS, which built the welfare state, which nationalised key industries and utilities, which introduced workers' rights, and which built council housing on a mass scale. It did all of this even though Britain lay in ruins and faced economic and financial disaster far worse than that we face today, because the political will and the movement was there. Harry saw the heir to this transformative government as Jeremy Corbyn and his team. Labour under Jeremy Corbyn reminds me of Labour in 1945, when it was a political movement that was for and by the people, he declared. He encouraged so many younger people who, inspired by his own message, to support the ideas and policies of a transformed Labour Party. When a new socialist government led by Jeremy Corbyn begins to build a new Britain, Harry will have more than played his part in getting there. Harry was a conscience of our movement. He showed that it's never too late to make a difference. He was 91 when his best-selling memoirs, Harry's Last Stand, was published. He encouraged and inspired millions, not just in Britain, but far from these shores too. The baton of struggle is passed from generation to generation. Those fights he fought for workers' rights, for the welfare state, for the NHS, for social justice, for peace, are being taken up by a new generation. There are so many who have played an inspiring role in the struggle for a new world who are no longer with us. In remembering them, we remember that we stand on the shoulders of giants. Harry was one of those giants. His struggle lives on in his son John and in so many in every corner of this planet. So today, we remember a man of compassion, of love, of solidarity, and of moral courage. But there is no better way to honour his memory than for us all to recommit to building a new world, free of all forms of oppression, exploitation, bigotry, and violence. So thank you, Harry, for inspiring and encouraging us, and together we will build the just world for which you fought for your entire life.
Thank you, Owen, for that wonderful tribute from a young rebel to an old rebel. Harry was thrilled, absolutely thrilled, in 2015 at the election of Labour leader of a man he felt shared his values, was a kindred spirit. He was thrilled again in 2016, although I don't think he wanted that election to happen. But our next speaker, well, he's dangerous to Tories, he's dangerous to fat cats. He's dangerous, he's dangerous. He's dangerous to bad bosses, he's dangerous to bad landlords, he's dangerous to privateers, but he's a hero for all those who want social change. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for being here. And it's wonderful that we're here in Conway Hall to celebrate the life of Harry Leslie Smith, because this hall is the place where we all come to when we need to commemorate somebody who's fallen, or we need to launch a campaign to drive out an injustice, or we need to unite people to support people who are suffering. This hall is a place that has special meaning for many, many people in all aspects of the labour movement. Indeed, I was explaining on my way here to Carrie and others as we were coming that I owe my life to Conway Hall. And they all stared at me and said, well, what happened? Was it a fire? Was it an accident? Was there something tragic? I said, no, I owe my life to Conway Hall. Well, it's like this. There was a meeting in this hall, in this very room, in the 1930s, in solidarity with the people of Spain. My mum sat over there, and my dad sat over there. One of the speakers probably went on a bit too long. It happens at meetings. And their eyes met. And here I am. And so it's, to me, an enormous honour to be able to say to you, I'm speaking on behalf of the Labour Party in remembering the life of Harry Leslie Smith. And our condolences to John and all that he's had to go through. And the lovely words that he wrote to me to say that he will carry on his dad's work. Well, John, yes, you will, but you won't be alone, because we're all going to carry on Harry Leslie's work. Harry was born in Barnsley in 1923 to Lillian and Albert, an unemployed coal miner, living in desperate poverty in the 1920s in a country that was supposed to be building homes fit for heroes at the end of the Second World War. His eldest sister died, as he explained, in 1926, aged 11, of the wholly preventable condition of TB in the poorhouse because the family couldn't afford a doctor. Harry suffered all through the privations of the 1920s and 1930s. The general strike, when the union movement was defeated by a Tory government, but never really defeated because we always come back. And all through the Depression. And then came the Second World War. And Harry joined up, he joined the RAF, and as he said in one of his speeches, and I was quite moved by it, he said, it was the first time in his life, remember this, born in 1923, was 1941, that he got 3 meals a day in the forces, in the RAF. And he witnessed what was going on at the end of the Second World War and ended up in Germany at the end of the Second World War, where he met his wife, Frida. They were not allowed to marry because of some law in Britain that British and German people were not allowed to marry because we'd been at war. We were at war with fascism, not with German people. Couldn't they have ever understood that when they wrote that law? And Harry then returned. He returned to a country that had been ravaged by the Second World War and wanted to change things around. Because they couldn't marry, I understand, they emigrated to Canada, where Harry worked there, and they had children, 3 sons. Sadly, only John survives. Harry learnt a lot from that life and from the death of his sons. And that inspired him to turn to writing. And he wrote the book, Harry's Last Stand. And I was just saying to the publishers when we were coming in, Why didn't Harry take up writing 50 years earlier? Why leave it so late? Because the book is absolutely brilliant. And Harry was not afraid of using social media, and indeed had 250,000 followers on Twitter. He was, as Owen said, a giant of our movement. He could capture people's attention and appealed to all generations. Because his was a real life experience, the son of a miner growing up in the Great Depression, caring for an ill sister, and defeating fascism. That is what turned Harry into a socialist. He hated poverty because he'd grown up in poverty. He hated class privilege because his sister had died at the age of 11 and the family couldn't afford the medical care that she needed, just like thousands and thousands of others died in desperate poverty during that period. And as one who had seen what war was about and what it was like, and the bombing and the effect it had on civilian people, be those civilians in Germany or in Britain or in France or anywhere else, or those that died in Russia, he saw the reality of war, and he had lost friends in that war. So he dedicated his life to peace. And he hated racism and bigotry because he'd seen what fascism had done to Germany, and he had seen what bigotry had done to his own family. So he had this humane decency about him, this socialism about him, and it made him into a genuine internationalist. He realized there was nothing inevitable about poverty. There was nothing inevitable about it. It had to be challenged, it had to be fought for and changed in a different way. He was a man of the most unbelievable level of optimism. And as Owen was saying, in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, all those young men and women that took off their uniforms and put on their working clothes and wanted to build a country that was decent, that was fair, that was just. Every newspaper, particularly, by the way, the Daily Mail, predicted the Tories would win the 1945 election by a landslide led by Winston Churchill. How wrong they were in measuring the feelings of ordinary people. And by the way, they've got it wrong a few times since then as well. And that election resulted in a Labour government committed to social change, committed to building houses, committed to building a national health service, committed to a moral empowerment of people of the kind of world you could live in. That was achieved by people like Harry, who gave their all to ensure that we had a national health service in the future. Because Harry also, yes, was passionate about the NHS, yes, was passionate about mental health, yes, was passionate about social care, but he was also passionate about the decency we need within our society. And he was a great admirer of what Tony Benn said: all political questions are moral questions, because in reality, it's the morality of the life you lead and the way in which you want other people to be able to lead their lives. Harry tapped into our emotions in what he said and the way he said it. That amazing speech he made to the Labour Party conference in 2014 had people in tears as a result of it. I heard him make similar speeches in other places. Indeed, one that he made at the Brighthelm Centre in Brighton to promote his book was quite an extraordinary speech, and he very kindly gave me a copy of his book, one of my treasured possessions. And so Harry then spent his last years promoting his book and promoting decency and social justice. But Harry had the amazing ability to inspire young people despite being in his 90s, because he was telling the truth and because he was inspiring people to achieve something better in the world. But he was also an internationalist. Harry supported the refugees in Calais. Harry supported refugees when they were trying to survive in this country. His view was that in difficult times, you don't turn your back on people that are suffering the worst privations. You reach out to them, because when you reach out to them, we're all made stronger as a result of it. Harry defended health, defended education, defended young people, and used every modern form of communication to get that message across. Harry, sadly, is no longer with us, but he will be remembered for a very long time to come as that decent man, that man who inspired others because of his own experience and his determination that nobody would ever experience what he experienced, but also his ability to reach out to others, to fight racism, to oppose fascism, to oppose inequality and injustice in our society. Harry is gone, but the baton falls to John, and it falls to all of us to deliver a better society. And you know what? We will. We will have an education system that takes the commodity away from education and inserts the right to learn, the right to know, the right to be educated. We will have a health service that remains forever free at the point of use, that does deal with the inequalities that lead to ill health in the first place. And in Harry's memory, to somebody that grew up in such appalling housing conditions and such poverty, modern London, modern Birmingham, modern Manchester, with sadly thousands of people sleeping rough on the streets while luxury flats are kept empty by security guards. That will change. We want to house the homeless. We want to house the homeless and give hope to people. And we want a government that doesn't glory in selling arms to a country that's bombing the people of Yemen or indeed anywhere else. We want a government that as its core principle are human rights, human justice and human values, that doesn't see refugees as a threat or an enemy, but sees refugees, just like all of us, as human beings going through a bad time who need us to reach our arms out to support and help them. Harry taught us a lot. Harry was an inspiration to me and obviously an inspiration to everybody in this hall. In Harry's memory, let's redouble our efforts to challenge the privilege and inequality and those that message privilege and inequality to confuse people who ought to be instead embracing the principles of a welfare state, of social justice, and of the socialist values that we hold. I say to Harry, thank you for what you did in your life, thank you for your inspiration, and thank you all for being here in memory of a great man. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. A rebel with a cause, and you can make Harry's dream come true. Another of our rebel souls here tonight is Jenny Formby, General Secretary of the Labour Party, a job that isn't without its demands and challenges. But Jenny was anxious to be here tonight to express her thanks to Harry and his son John for their constant championing of the Labour cause. Thank you, Jenny Formby.
Thank you, and I feel incredibly privileged to be here to say just a few words that sum up my own views of Harry and what he meant to all of us. You've heard already 2 fantastic speeches. You're going to hear a lot more tonight. And when I was thinking about what I was going to say, John reminded me that I'd written to him after Harry died, and I looked at the letter and thought that that summed up what I wanted to say. So I'm going to read it to you because I think that that crystallises my thoughts and hopefully a lot of others. Harry was an incredible man who touched the lives of so many with his indomitable spirit, his integrity, and his unshakable belief that if we fight together, it really is possible to transform our world into one where justice and fairness can be the watchwords for the way in which we're governed. I'll never forget the first time I saw Harry speak, which is when I was Unite Political Director, And Harry was one of the keynote speakers at the Unite Real Britain Fringe at Labour Party conference. It was in the Unite Marquee in 2014. Harry had us all spellbound with his harrowing account of the grinding poverty he experienced in his early life and the illness and subsequent tragic death of his sister. The room was packed. It was standing room only, but as Harry spoke, you could have heard a pin drop. And there wasn't a dry eye in the venue, including among the many hard-as-nails industrial trade unionists who were there. And yes, Len, I'm looking at you too. Needless to say, we cheered him to the rooftops, just as we did a day or so later when he gave his barnstorming speech from the main platform at conference, and he told the Tories so clearly to keep your mitts off our NHS. Harry's story had a profound effect on me and on many thousands of other people who either heard him speak at the countless other events and conferences that he's spoken at since, or who've read his gripping books. I'm so grateful to you, John, for lending Harry to us in the latter years of his life, and for the incredible and constant support that you gave to him to enable him to do so much. And I'm so heartened too to see that you're going to be continuing the work that Harry did to raise awareness of the plight of refugees and all those whose lives have been so terribly damaged by being forced to live in grinding but avoidable poverty wherever in the world they may be. My copy of Harry's Last Stand is a very valued book and one that I had hoped to get personally inscribed one day. But sadly, that will now never happen. But I'll always carry the lessons he taught us in my heart. And I just want to finish by saying, Harry, your legacy lives on in all of us who are here. We're here to carry on that struggle, and we'll never forget you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And I remember that 5 years ago being blown away, as just remembering with Len, we were blown away by Harry, wondering where he'd been hidden all those decades. What a force of life he was. For Harry, there were no no-go areas, there was no injustice he would not tackle. And at an age when a lot of people would be putting their slippers on or putting their feet up, he took up the cause of refugees who he felt were terribly exploited and discriminated against, and he was sickened at the mistreatment they faced. Laura Paduan has worked for the UN Refugee Agency. She co-chairs Families Together, which is a campaign to bring refugees together when they've been scattered around the world. The refugee cause was so dear to Harry's heart. Laura.
Thank you. I'd like to start with some of Harry's own words. Life is short. Blink and it is gone. So before we are no more, we should aspire to do something that makes us a better human being. We must become more accountable for our actions at home and at work. In the end, the only ambition that matters is that our existence creates more good than harm to our families and our communities. It ensures that our epitaph is written with love rather than with regret by those who we encountered in life. I can say that for everyone who encountered Harry, in person, through his writing, or through his tweeting, he made sure that without doubt, his epitaph was written with love. Harry was a fierce advocate for refugees. At a time when society seemed so divided and fueled by hate, Harry's wisdom and experience reminded us of the fragility of a hard-won peace that could be shattered at any time. Whilst for us in Britain, war is but a memory, for many people around the world, it is a harsh and brutal reality. It was because Harry witnessed the faces of those fleeing the horrors of the Second World War that he came to have a great compassion for refugees fleeing today's conflicts. But unlike most people, Harry chose to do something about it. In 1945, as a young British soldier in the Royal Air Force, he saw 100,000 emaciated, desperate refugees flowing out of Nazi Germany. When he was face to face with refugees, he gave them whatever food he had, and he reassured them that they were safe. And he said that for the first time, he saw a gleam of hope in their faces. In his last years, Harry embarked on his Last Stand tour, dedicated to travelling to as many refugee hotspots as possible and to raise a rallying cry for the global refugee crisis. He visited a border crossing between Quebec and New York State and met with refugees in Toronto. He travelled to the squalor of Calais to meet people displaced by untold terror and conflict, yet who could find no sanctuary in Europe. Harry listened to their stories, and he used his voice to draw attention to their plight. After his visit, Harry said, "Calais was so frightening. I couldn't believe it when I stepped into the camp. It reminded me of when my unit reached Hamburg. I felt so sorry when this young boy sidled up to me. He was 10. He was in Calais alone. He had lost his parents. How can we allow that?" He was crystal clear that we must learn from the past, and he urged political leaders against the barbarity of war. "We have to live together," he said. "It's our only hope of survival." Harry said that there are many things that we can do if we put our minds to it, and we shouldn't leave anyone out, no matter what their nationality or colour or traits are. When Harry saw injustice, when he saw the plight of refugees, the familiar scene that he'd observed 6 decades earlier in the ruins of Europe, he took a stand. Humanity, he said, is the key to peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Rebelling all her life, my friend and colleague Roswyn Jones, I often describe her as the conscience of the mirror. Some people say that's so I don't have to have a conscience. But she introduced me and many of our readers to Harry and was a partner in crime with him, going around the country exposing poverty and shining a spotlight in areas that are too often neglected. Ros, please.
Thank you. I first met Harry 5 years ago in 2014 when I interviewed him for The Mirror. I couldn't wait to meet this amazing man that I'd heard about. He was an old soldier, an RAF hero, who at the age of 91 was making this last stand to fight for the NHS that his generation had built. By the time we'd finished our interview in a pub in Soho, I'd already invited him to speak at the Mirror and Unite Fringe at Labour Conference. His effect on me had just been total inspiration, and I wanted as many other people as possible to hear his heartfelt and really hopeful message. But Harry had that effect wherever he went. When he came to our Fringe event, as we've just heard, about 300 people stood up and gave him a standing ovation, and news of his speech spread like wildfire. And he was invited onto the main stage of the conference during the NHS debate, where he once again lit up the stage. And I can remember sitting at the back of the conference hall with tears pouring down my face, watching his galvanising effect on a movement that was at that time feeling the despair of being out of office and watching Tory austerity destroy so many good things that Labour had done. And after that speech, of course, the rest is history. But as Harry used to tell us all the time, he was history. And Harry and John and I became friends after that. And I doubt that I was the only person who used to take a little fix of hope every time I saw his smile wheel into view. Harry had this incredible quality of never seeming tired, even though he must have been with the weight of all that history on his shoulders. And John always did the most amazing job of keeping him going with cups of tea, warm words, halves of beer, and sometimes glasses of champagne. And one of the things that I loved about Harry was that he was a champagne socialist. The last time that I met Harry was last winter. We were making our last little film for the Wigan Peer Project in Barnsley, and we knew it had to be about Harry. In 1936, George Orwell had described the terrible conditions in Harry's hometown, But as the child of an injured miner, Harry had lived that poverty, and his sister Marion, the inspiration behind everything that he did, had died of it, strapped to a bed because there was no money for painkillers. Because Harry was soon leaving for Canada, there was only 1 week that he could go to Barnsley to work on the film, which turned out to be quite a busy weekend for me. And so it was that I spent my honeymoon at Hoyland Working Men's Club in Barnsley. With Harry, which is the story of our film. And I'm really glad that I did, because he made the journey to Yorkshire without telling us that he actually had a terrible chest infection. And he seemed very vulnerable and much kind of less immortal than usual, a little bit closer to the past and a bit closer to his future. And he started telling Claire and Scott and Natasha, who are here today, and me, about the grocery bicycle that he'd borrowed as a boy, one of his first experiences of escaping poverty. And that's what we ended up making the film that you're about to see about. I miss Harry very much, but I also want to thank him, because in these raucous, difficult times when it can be hard to hear the voice of our own moral compass sometimes, all we need to ask ourselves is, what would Harry do? He taught us that it's never too late to stand up for what you believe in, and that you're never too old to be a rebel. He called on us all to gather the spirit of his generation into our hearts, to begin the task of rebuilding this country, Europe, and the world as it should be. And that's what we're here to take on today. So I'm really proud to show you this film. Thank you, Harry, and ta-ra.
I love the idea of Harry playing gooseberry at Rosa's honeymoon, that little grin of his, that cheeky grin. The last contact I had with Harry was, I asked him if he could remember the 1926 general strike, which I thought would be too far back in history even for Harry. But in fact, he did remember it. He remembered being on his coal miner dad's shoulders when the miners, beaten, were forced back to work. Well, Len McCluskey, if you did a photo fit of a rebel, I suspect his face would come up in any police line-out as that rebel. Len leads Unite. Unite, a union that fights to win. Len, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, and good evening, everyone. The first thing I want to say is a big, huge thank you to all of you to being here tonight. It's something that I think Harry would have been touched and humbled by the warmth and the love that we have in this room today. A few weeks ago, Harry, our friend, was honoured in his adopted country of Canada. Tonight, on the other side of the Atlantic, his friends here gather to remember a remarkable man. And yes, Harry was remarkable. After all, it takes a special kind of person to unite us in memory across oceans. You know, I often say that when working people join hands across nations and oceans, anything is possible. And for me, Harry embodies that belief. I first met Harry in September 2014 at the Labour Party conference. Of course, I was aware of Harry before that. We were all keen to know more about the new firebrand on the block. Who was this man who was telling us it straight, just like a Yorkshireman should do, warning us that we were sleepwalking away from all of the achievements that our class had won since horrific wars that defined the last century? It was the 2008 global economic crash that inspired Harry to pick up his pen. He'd seen it all before, you see, how capital never lets a good crisis go to waste. He feared that the spivs and the speculators, the political elite, would once again conspire to make us pay for their catastrophic errors, and in doing so, there would be a return to the horrific poverty of his childhood. He was right. In every shop doorway and at every food bank, we see the consequences of mindless austerity. Every one of our struggling fellow human beings stands testimony to the failings of a rancid political class. Those who have had a hand in today's manufactured tide of human misery are no different to those who sent children to the workhouse in the Great Depression but still slept soundly in their feathered beds at night. What would Harry say about how in 2019, almost a century on from his birth, Oxfam's extraordinary fact disclosed that just 26 people, 26 individuals, have as much wealth as half of the rest of the planet? What would he say about the sort of people last week trooping into the Tories' £300 a head black and white ball? Or those strange people who pay £70,000 to have dinner with Theresa May? I can tell you, colleagues, having now met the Prime Minister, they were robbed. Or of the men who gave us the rebooted austerity of the 2008 crash, David Cameron, there's a name, who has coined in almost £900,000 for doing absolutely nothing since he left office. Not that he did much when he was in it. And George Seven Jobs Osborne, who's just parted with £3 million of his own for his own slice of a ski chalet in a luxury area. I think I know what Harry would have said about those architects of the gross inequality of today. He would have said they really do deserve their own special place in hell. The interwar years of the 20th century were desperately cruel to people like Harry. Miserable housing and dreadful living conditions were the norm. The poverty he experienced is that which crushes the hope out of people. Poverty also kills. And it was poverty that took Harry's sister before she made it out of childhood. You know, Harry reminds me of my mum and dad. They too lost a child to consumption, the disease that killed tens of thousands of our class. The brother I never knew, John, was just 3 years old. And my dad, because he was away at the war, only seen him 6 times, the 6th time to bury him. They used to tell me of how young women with sick babies used to have to beg on the streets to get pennies to see a doctor, and how astonished and proud they were of the creation of the NHS. No wonder they would say they'd cut off their right arm before they'd ever vote Tory. Harry was growing up in a country which gave little to him or his class, and yet when asked to step forward in the fight to preserve our freedoms in the Second World War, they stood and served. Harry joined the RAF and was stationed in Germany as part of the Allied forces post-war. It was there that he met Frida, the love of his life, the woman who captured his heart and with whom he found the tremendous happiness and sadness of family life. His son John was his father's constant and devoted companion in recent years, and in John, Harry is a proud standard bearer for his work. Let me tell you about the first time that I met Harry. It was in a packed fringe meeting room at the Labour Party conference in Manchester in 2014. Labour wasn't in great shape then. Ed Miliband was being stalked by the ghosts of New Labour past. Harriet Arman was making lame jokes about Bake Off and falling as flat as a floppy souffle in the process. I was certain I'd be caught on camera nodding off in the conference hall as shadow minister after shadow minister danced around the danger of being caught in possession of an original idea. Jenny was spot on to talk about the Real Britain Fringe, and of course Kevin was the chair that day. Harry took the microphone at that Fringe meeting, packed out to the rafters, and I suddenly felt a surge of energy. Here was a man in his 10th decade, sent from the past to warn us about our future. He was a man with something to say. His voice was frail, but his message was mighty. He spoke of the indignities imposed on our class in a time before universal suffrage and public services, and gave a stark warning about the impact of the coalition's cruel welfare cuts on modern-day Britain. My generation lost its hope during the 30s, he said. Today's austerity is just as cruel and criminal as it was in my youth, and it will get worse and worse unless we fight those who want to take us back to those dark days. He reminded us never ever to stop being in awe of what Labour's post-war government had put in place: the NHS, the Education Act, homes fit for heroes, legal aid, public ownership of our common resources, and that we, the people, had had a revolution. I can tell you, we were spellbound in that room. He captured us all in the palm of his hand. Not a sound could be heard, and Jenny is right, tears that fell gently, including my own. He went on to do the same in conference hall, injecting emotion and hope into a jaded room. And when Owen told us of that great saying of his, keep our mitts off our NHS, our oldest rebel spoke for all of us. Harry was a man of honour. He backed Jeremy as Labour leader in 2015 and rallied in his defence as the right-wing malcontents endeavoured to unseat him in 2016. But I like to think that it wasn't just honour that motivated Harry's enduring support of Jeremy Corbyn. I think that Harry saw in Jeremy's programme a determination to deliver a better country, the determination that Owen said that he saw in the 1945 election, when they had to rebuild a ruined nation. He knew we needed another revolution. And when someone like Harry, who has seen firsthand what a government for the people can achieve, then it is our responsibility to listen to him. Harry understood the urgent need for political change because he had lived through it. He told us, I am not a historian, but I am history, and I fear its reputation. Comrades, there is so much to cause us to despair in modern life. Poverty, inequality, the rise of popular nationalism, the nastiness of social media. It can wound our spirits and take away our fight. But that wasn't Harry's style. Harry had seen it all before, and he was damn sure that we were not going back to those bad old days, at least not on his watch. So Harry was our unbreakable thread from our past to our future. He defied the odds of poor health to beat poverty and inequality, to live a long and full life. He was a tremendous public servant to this country and to our class. And he told us he knows how this will end, but that it doesn't have to be that way. We can do better. We can make certain that history doesn't repeat itself as a tragedy. We have choices. We can choose to seek a better future. We can choose to break with the failures of past politics. We can choose not to look the other way when our fellow humans are suffering, be they refugees or children going hungry to school. We can choose to speak out against injustice. We can today, each and every one of us in this room, choose to stand with Harry. We can also choose to stand with one of the most decent and honourable men in politics, our leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and make certain those right-wing establishment hacks who seek to attack him every day, often aided by those traitors within our own midst, that Jeremy understands that we stand closely with him and we will achieve what we set out to do. When I sent Harry a birthday greetings, his 95th, last February, from all his friends in Unite, he responded and said, "I'm chuffed to bits. Thanks, Len, and thanks to all at Unite. The work you do inspires me to keep buggering on." Well, Harry did keep buggering on. And with him gone, we must commit to continuing to do so. The same, relentlessly celebrating the spirit of this incredible man by committing to carry on his work. Owen, you were right to remind us of that great saying. Harry was a giant, and it's our duty now, brothers and sisters, to stand on his shoulders. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Len. And I know Harry was always very proud to stand with you and Unite and your million-plus members in struggles. We're now going to have a film before we resume the speeches, and Ros is going to introduce the Wigan Peer Project, which she did with Harry, or partly with Harry. Oh, we're going to just show it, are we? There we are. The Wigan Peer Project.
Most nights my sister and I would go to bed with a growling stomach because we hadn't had any supper. I remember tramping to school, and my stomach was giving me so much pain and discomfort. All I could think of was a small glass of milk that the government had allowed the schools to provide for people who were down on their luck. The places you lived in were nothing more than doss houses, which housed as many as 30 or 35 people. I have a terrible feeling that we are going back to those times. Why does it have to be that we have to have food banks? There must be a solution that doesn't require people to throw themselves on the mercy of this food bank system. As a child, when I went to bed, I had this feeling of flight, as though I was flying up in the sky. But I only got so far, I was due to a halt because I was chained to where I was living. My mother used to send me to my grandma's in the summer. There was Uncle Ted and there was Uncle Harold. His wife worked on the local farm. She had a bicycle which she suggested that I use her bike, and she would just walk to the farm. I did get the gist of it eventually, and I felt like a bird flying away. That bike gave me the freedom that I didn't get with my nightly dreams, you know. We were very warm as a family because Mother and Father were still in love. It was only later on that the rift began after my father injured himself in the mines and couldn't work anymore. The ordinary worker was not considered a human being. It wouldn't be the assets that the mining companies used to further their wealth and needs. Today, even the young people in the country are desolate because they can't get the right type of work that pays them a decent salary. When our governments are more interested in the profit and loss of their most affluent constituents and ignore the rest of its citizens, it's time those governments were turfed out. I'm so tired of governments that tolerate this sort of thing. We are educated people. We are people who have been through the thick and thin of life already, and we should know by now what we like and what we prefer to happen to our country. We have to help those who are there to help us. My name is Harry Leslie Smith, and I am in the book tonight to wish you all the best. Ta-ra.
Wow, what a man. We're now going to rotate the speakers. The stage wasn't large enough to get everybody on at the same time, and tributes to Harry. Tribute to Harry, actually, himself, that so many people wanted to speak. So just like to thank Len and Jenny and Jeremy and Owen and Laura and Roz, who spoke earlier. But resuming, he was a literary sensation, Harry, with that book, Harry's Last Stand. I remember reading it and thinking, God, I'd love to write like this, and I'm glad he didn't start in journalism earlier, or I might never got my own chance. But it was such a brilliant, vivid tale, and he wrote so magnificently, and he had an incredibly close relationship with somebody who was really important in his life, and that is Kate Hewson, who was his editor. And without Kate, we would have never read those books. Kate.
I published Harry's Last Stand back in 2014, and I was lucky enough to call Harry a friend in the years since. And while I'd kind of love to talk about the latter, because it was such a great privilege to get to know him, I want to say a few words about Harry as a writer, because I think his words had such an impact on so many of us. He'd written wonderful self-published memoirs before, but the first time I encountered Harry's writing was in 2013 with his Guardian piece, This Year I'll Wear the Poppy for the Last Time. I just turned 26, and reading this 90-year-old writing from Canada felt, actually for the first time in my life, like I was reading political writing that really spoke to me. And that was Harry's great talent as a writer. He naturally paired the personal and the passionate with absolutely watertight logic and political theory in a way that just made everything feel alive and immediate. So when a book proposal arrived for what eventually became Harry's Last Stand, I desperately wanted to publish it. We edited the entire thing over email, which as a general rule is a total recipe for disaster, but Harry was essentially the perfect author. Incredibly quick, responsive, collaborative, and completely non-defensive. The most important thing to him was that other people were going to read his work and take something away from it. There was no ego involved, and he didn't want anything to get in the way of that. He was also an incredibly witty and sharp email correspondent. You only have to have seen his greatest Twitter troll takedowns to get some sense of that. I kind of wanted to read some out, but I was going through them and I sort of was a bit worried that some of them were a bit strongly worded for the occasion. And of course, the book that he wrote was everything you'd want it to be. an urgent, incredibly intelligent, but passionate manifesto for how we could stop the world slipping back to the harsh and dangerous one that he'd grown up in. After publication, he came over to the UK to speak at the Labour Party conference and embarked on this epic tour, going all around the country, appearing on TV, radio, at countless political conferences and rallies with an energy that few of us could match. And it was on this trip that I actually met him in person for the first time, with John, in a Costa Coffee in a Premier Inn in Euston. He was not an author who demanded a huge rider. And I remember being a bit nervous about meeting him because in so many ways he was absolutely an intellectual heavyweight, and I was acutely aware of the huge gaps in my own political knowledge if that was what he wanted to talk about. But actually he wanted to talk about what it was like being an editor and how much was my rent and how did I meet my boyfriend and what were our lives like. And he spoke about Frida and about his children, his family and the life that they'd had. In essence, he wanted to talk about people. And in the years following, even though Harry was probably the busiest man in the country and I wasn't even his editor anymore, he always stayed in touch and we'd have dinner and the odd pint of shandy with John and my husband. And had illness not prevented it, they'd have both been at our wedding. And whenever anything big or good happened to us, it always crossed my mind to tell Harry because he'd made it so clear that he actually cared. And after I met him that first time, I did feel a bit stupid, but not for the reasons that I thought I would, but because I should have known that that's what Harry would be like, because it's exactly what he was like in his writing. The whole reason that he was talking about politics and writing about politics was because he cared about people. And if anyone ever says that older people are naturally more prejudiced or more closed-minded, you just have to think of Harry and his passionate defences of young people, of LGBTQ+ rights, and of refugees. His political code and his code as a man, I think, was actually a very simple one, based on empathy and humanitarianism, and on the basic but all too rare desire that other people shouldn't go through the hardships that he'd been through. He blazed such a trail in the last 10 years that as much as his losses felt, we can only really remember him with admiration and try to keep learning something from him.
All right, Kate, your next job is to find us the new Harry. Tomorrow will do. All right, you probably don't get more rebel than giving up a job with Deloitte as a tax advisor to run a refugee charity. But that's what Claire Mosley did. She set up Care for Calais after visiting the jungle back in 2015, and I know it was a cause very, very dear to the heart of Harry, and we'll have a collection for it at the end. Claire, please.
Thank you. In 2015, when I'd only been in Calais for a few months, a reporter interviewed me, and he asked how he should describe me in his article, and he suggested an activist. And at that point, I said, oh my goodness, no, I'm just a volunteer. Because at the beginning, the crisis seemed straightforward to me. It was a humanitarian crisis. Refugees were just people in trouble, and I was just somebody there to help them. But since then, I've learned a lot of things, and it's become more complicated. If he asked me now, I would say, damn right, I'm an activist. Harry lived a long life and learned a lot more than me, and he was most definitely an activist. In fact, he went a step further. He was the world's oldest rebel. And in that long life, he saw a lot and learned a lot, and he was determined that knowledge would be put to good use for our future, because he'd seen both what was good and what was bad in the world. In 1945, he saw refugees after the war. He described thousands of people from whom everything had been taken by war. People without hope who had nothing left, walking with glazed eyes by their thousands, pitiful and starving. In 2016, when he came to Calais, he described the similarities. How once again he was meeting people who have lost everything through conflict, people who are living in a squalid camp. He described their weariness. I came back from Calais last night, and unfortunately since 2016 it's only got worse. There are still many hundreds of people who have done nothing wrong, living in the freezing rain and the mud, being abused by people in authority less than 30 miles from our shore. Harry was eloquent, but he was also blunt and to the point. He compared turning your back on these people to averting your eyes from a sinking ship. I can only imagine what he would say now about the rescue boats being stopped from going out into the Mediterranean. However, he also used his experience to inspire us. In 1945, he saw Britain take in 200,000 refugees from Poland. He talked about how proud this made him feel. He talked of British soldiers working tirelessly to save people from squalid camps. That was at a time of great austerity, when the country was rebuilding and times were tough, and yet he talked about how it made us stronger to pull together and do something good. Austerity does not stop us from doing good. He talked about how well these people integrated into British society and the good that came from it. He's described parallels in Canada, where refugees have been welcomed and society has benefited. He used a phrase that I love: this is a preventable tragedy, because the problems in Calais are not impossible to fix and the solutions are within our reach. When Care for Calais first started, we were focused on delivering aid. It was an emergency response to an immediate need. But as time has gone on and things have not, as we hoped, improved, campaigning and speaking out, activism, has become the second half of our mission. Because the most important thing that refugees need is a safe home. For the few hundred people in Calais, this is something that Britain could provide. To have someone like Harry as a figurehead, inspiring people to get involved, means the world to our volunteers on the ground. It can feel lonely in Calais. Day-to-day life is tough. The support and inspiration of people in the UK means everything. It's on your behalf that we do the work that we do. Harry left us while the UK is still failing to do its fair share. But he's left behind an army of inspired volunteers, activists, and members of the public who won't let this carry on. Care for Calais will continue the work that he started, and I'm sure that you will too. I stand with Harry.
Thank you, Claire. And I think I've now realised we've got, I think, every rebel in Britain here. Jack Monroe, a.k.a. the bookstrap cook, is a chip off Harry's old block, and he recognised in her writings about bringing up a toddler on the breadline how a past he hoped had been left behind was here in our present now. Jack, please.
Sometime back in 2013, I received an email out of the blue from an elderly man saying that because of me, he'd decided to take up social justice campaigning. I felt thoroughly irresponsible. And so it's with great irony as a writer that when John asked me if I would speak today, I sat down and I got my laptop out and I twiddled my pen, and I couldn't think of a single buggering word to say. So instead, I'm going to read you an excerpt from Harry's last stand. It's going to sound a bit odd because I'm going to be talking as though I am Harry, so you're going to have to imagine that I am a man in my 90s who has lived through war and depression and disease. I was an ordinary man who lived through extraordinary times. I am one of the last remaining voices from an era from when Britain was savage and brutal to all those who did not have wealth. Now, when I shave in the morning and look at the skin on my face, broken and cracked with age, and my hands thin and frail, I wonder to myself what became of that young man who survived the Great Depression, and what happened to that Britain that delivered from the ashes of war, peace, and economic security to its citizens. The young man and Britain as a compassionate nation are no more. Neoliberalism has turned our welfare state into a beautiful pile of rubble. It was exposed to the indifference of successive governments for too long. And moreover, this generation has allowed the 1% to steal its birthright, and that can't continue for much longer without Britain returning to my past. If we, in the 21st century, are forced to return to my past because the Tories have successfully murdered the welfare state, it will be more brutal and bloodier for you than it was for me so many years ago. This time there will be no mercy, because the state will be able to monitor and control all facets of your life. Our entire lives can be traced from use of our mobiles and emails, comments on social media, purchases via credit card and the use of loyalty cards. Our anonymity has gone, and our state has greater weaponry for social control than ever before. It will be impossible now to resist and mobilise like we did in the 1930s and 1940s. You must begin to act now, for tomorrow will be too late. Everything we have today in terms of social benefits originates from those 6 years when Labour were in government after the war. Without the Attlee government, Britain would have been a dark and fearful place during the second half of the 20th century. And yet many of our citizens are ignorant of the history and made arrogant by the fake news of the right wing, which disparages the great accomplishments we made as a nation. When we cleared the slums, we gave free healthcare to all, built affordable homes, made higher education accessible to working class kids. We shouldn't be where we are today as a people and as a society. 1 million people should not need to use food banks in order to keep their bellies full. Politics has failed our people, and now too many are turning to right-wing populists, the way the poor once flocked to snake oil salesmen to cure their ailments. All of our political parties are at fault and should be ashamed, but some are far guiltier than others. We must start telling the hard and bitter truth about how we can build a new and vibrant social democratic state for everyone. They must not develop policies through polls and triangulations as if human life were an algorithm to be manipulated. My life has straddled 2 centuries, and I witnessed both great and infamous events. But what defines my personality and how I view Britain and the world stems from my childhood of extreme poverty and those 6 turbulent years when Labour sought to recreate Britain in the likeness of ordinary people. It's why I've not lost faith in left-wing politics, despite my disappointments. The world we live in today is rife with corruption, populism, and economic sectarianism. This is a harbinger of worse things to come. And if we do not fight against austerity, the gradual privatisation of the NHS, or our addiction to fake news, we will be frog-marched back to my childhood, where no one lived well except the rich. I know my moment on this earth is almost done. I will soon join my mother, my father, sisters, brothers, wife, son, and friends who passed on before me. I have tried to relate to you what I have learned and seen through many years of life because we are in the most dangerous of times. It will be up to you to decide whether you fight for sunlight or submit to weakness. I am too old now to do much more but tell the truth about the history of my generation. To survive, live well, and enjoy love, you must choose the path of your ancestors. In you is the blood of all of those who fought for fair wages, housing, healthcare, who defended our island against the tyranny of Hitler. In you is the light that your grandparents had when they fought to preserve and expand the civil society through the welfare state. And if you do not call upon the wisdom and the spirit of my generation, you will regress to an era where want and ignorance were deadly to Britain. I can't make that decision for you. I've shown you what the world looked like when the 1% enslaved an entire generation to feed their greed. It's now up to you, because the sunset has come to my life, but you must not let it come to our country. It shouldn't be this way. It should be better for you. You deserve more than the second-rate politics of Theresa May and the third-rate lives many lead because of austerity. I was born in the darkest of times, and it seems that I will exit this world in a similar era of uncertainty, inequality, and cruelty. Right now, we're at a juncture in history that is as dangerous to this generation as the 1930s were to mine. There are serious threats of war emerging all across the globe, some caused by the folly of neoliberalism and others just erupting because we forgot that tyranny, if fed, will fester in even the healthiest of societies. It's your choice now to decide whether you let the jungles of greed, neoliberalism and corporations grow over and obscure the welfare state like vines and forest growth obscured the great Mayan civilizations a millennium ago, or you can reclaim your rights. My past won't become your future if you hold firm to the belief that all people are born equal, that all people deserve the rights to a life free of want, ignorance, and sickness. Believe in yourselves and in social justice, and live by the creed that we are all our brother's keeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Harry Leslie Smith's passing, we all lost a friend and an inspiration, but only one person in this room tonight lost a father. So it's right and proper and fitting that the final speech is from his son, John Smith.
Now, before I start my speech, I was thinking, I'd like to tell you this story about Harry. On his 80th birthday, I remember I asked him, I said, "How do you feel?" And he said, "I feel a bit pissed off." I said, "Why?" And he said, "I think I'm losing my hair." And at that point, I hadn't had hair for 20 years. And I said, "You know, there is a reason why your mother called you the Beau Brummel of Boothtown Road. Because he always was a dandy up until the end. He thought he dressed the best as a working class man, he looked the best, and in the end, he knew how to dance the best." But anyways, I'd like to thank Unite the Union, Roswin Jones, Icon Books, and all those unseen people who helped put this event together. Harry would have been chuffed and humbled by tonight's event. To all the speakers, thank you for your loving words to my dad, and to all who came tonight and who are watching on the live stream, and were as many fans, thank you for your love, loyalty over the years, because it did help sustain him as he approached that long good night called death. Thanks also to Little Brown, Matthew Hamilton, and Jamie Coleman. It feels odd standing here on stage because normally my place was with you, the audience, in a seat marveling at my dad's words and presence on stage that left people enthralled by his memories and passion for social justice. I always remember that at the end of each event, I would greet my dad off stage and tell him how well he had done. And in emotional exhaustions, he generally replied, "Quit the cackle, let's get a beer." And I can't begin to tell you how much I wish that after I finished this tribute to him, that I would find him off stage so that we could share a beer and a laugh together. Although I know if I did see him for that beer, he'd give me a bollocking and say, "You didn't have to tell him that I have been a lifelong bigot of parsnips and can become a little intolerant of my soup is served to me cold by you." February 25th, 1923 to November 28th, 2018 is a long and brilliant run for anyone to live. But for my dad, what a life it was, because bookended between those years, he traveled through the ignoble and great history of the 20th century as an ordinary man living through extraordinary times. Born into abject state-endorsed poverty, witness to the general strike of 1926, beer barrow boy, champion pea shooter, book lover, budding poet, grocer's assistant, warrior against Hitler's fascism, soldier and occupier in a defeated Nazi Germany, lover, friend, and husband to Elfriede Gisela Edelman, socialist, lifelong labor voter, supporter and champion of Jeremy Corbyn, new immigrant, manual laborer, night school student, father, field surgeon to an army of G.I. Joes, wounded by rough housing, oriental carpet expert, twist dance instructor to his sons on Christmas Eve, protester to apartheid, vocal opponent to the Iraq War, austerity, the privatization of the NHS, and anything that didn't sit well with him, champion of the underdog, and an endless supporter to the endeavors of his wife and sons, retiree, the greatest crooner of the shower, caregiver, advocate for the mentally ill, gardener, marmalade prig, arm to lean on, wise man, king of social media, but knave when it came to a television remote, author, public speaker, pain in the arse to the mighty, comrade, my best friend, and the world's oldest rebel. What a life it was. And it leaves me breathless because I was part of that life. And I witnessed him live life with so much passion, love, empathy, desire, humor, and gentleness for 95 years. All of us are only granted a brief dance to the music of time, but my dad took those moments of existence and made them matter for not only himself, but those he loved and those who believed in social justice. Few of us will live as long as he did or see and experience as much as he did. Think of it. He was born in 1923, just 20 years after the first motorized airplane flight at Kitty Hawk, and he died almost 100 years later in a world changed by technology, but still plagued by the greed of the entitled. In each season of his life, he was vibrant and determined to grow as an individual, even in the cold blaze of old age when death stalked him, and he felt his body wither like a garden in winter. My dad did not shrink from living and loving. But where do I begin in the telling of the story about this remarkable, unique, beautiful creature that was my father? I am the last person in his life to truly know him and love him because his wife, my mother, and my brother Peter predeceased him. His friends from his youth are dead. His brothers and sisters are dead. His friends from his middle age are dead. All those who shaped his life but me are dead. My dad said that living into your 90s was like being a rare beast forever separated from its species, caged in a zoo, adored by strangers that don't speak your language. So it is left to me to conjure out of words who Harry Leslie Smith was as a boy, a teenager, a young recruit in the RAF, a suitor to my mother, a father, a caregiver to his wife and my brother, and my best friend for the last 10 years of his life. At night now, when I close my eyes, I think back to the early years of my childhood. I can hear the wind that once rustled through a row of poplar trees that stood in the schoolyard at the back of my family's suburban house located just outside of Toronto. I can see my family when they were young and all of our lives stood before us with the surety of happiness, like daybreak on a brilliant summer holiday. I can feel the contentment of bedtime when I was 6 and knew that before sleeping, my dad would entertain me with a story. But one evening, I grew tired of Peter Rabbit and asked my dad to tell me another story. Do you want to hear about Christopher Robin and Pooh Bear, he asked. No, I said. I want to hear the story about you, I replied. And so in a series of bedtime stories, I learned that the happy life my family had wasn't the way of the world. Like a master tailor, my dad threaded his early life into the fabric of my soul and tied it tightly with the bonds of love, loyalty, and family. In the comfort of my childhood bed, my dad revealed to me all the unhappiness of his early youth. He told me about his life growing up in a series of slums in Barnsley, Bradford, and Halifax, the trinity of his early despair. He spoke to me of his eldest sister Marion's battle with TB, her confinement and death at the age of 10 in a workhouse infirmary. He told me about how she was dumped into a pauper's pit, and how at the age of 7 he was put to work as a beer barrow boy and forced to forage through rubbish bins to keep from starving. You see, I was almost Canadian there for a second. Each tale of suffering told was countered by another story that revealed that my dad had many moments of great happiness, love, and laughter during his harsh childhood. Still, no matter the scars, both physical and emotional, that my dad gained as a bairn, swathed in poverty, he ensured that his children would not know the sorrows of hunger, homelessness, and lives thwarted by lack of opportunity. Because as he told us, and we didn't appreciate as much as we should of in our teenage years, that the welfare state, along with his hard work, had kept us in comfort. And each turn of my life, along with my brother's life, he showered us with love, affection, and encouragement to follow our dreams and taught us how to be decent human beings. My dad had a quiet and gentle nobility that not even the horrors of the Second World War could tarnish. In fact, his capacity for empathy for the vulnerable didn't diminish, but grew while he served in the RAF during the 20th century's bloodiest of wars. His encounters with refugees in 1945 in newly liberated Holland and Germany left a strong watermark of compassion on his soul. But it was in Hamburg, where my dad was stationed as part of the post-war occupational forces, that his life was transformed by a chance encounter at a ramshackle black market with a young German woman who he fell in love with at first sight. The young German woman, however, was no slave to sentimentality and understood the words of Tommy soldiers were cheap and dangerous. But over time, in a city ravaged by war, teeming with despair and loneliness, they became lovers, and then friends, and then husband and wife. Even to this day, it astounds me that my mother trusted my father so much that she agreed to leave her native country and settle in Britain with him, because that is an enormous ask, considering that in 1948, resentment to Germans in Britain was still strong because of the Second World War, and that the world wasn't interconnected and able to communicate with each other in the only way was through letters that were written to each other. So she, in truth, had to give up home, friends, traditions, and her native tongue to be with my dad. Those early years weren't easy times for my mom or my dad, and their marriage almost fell apart in England. It got so bad between them that my mother even left my father and returned to Germany, feeling that her love affair with my dad had run its course. Somehow their love for each other prevailed, but they both knew it wasn't going to flourish in a Britain that in 1951 had rejected Labour for Winston Churchill and his class-conscious Tories. So they decided to up sticks and emigrate to Canada. So at the age of 30, my dad, along with my mom, embarked on a great odyssey by traveling to a new and faraway land. It was there in Canada that my parents put down roots, were able, because of the welfare state, to purchase a home, bring up children into a world where there was food on the table, and create a household that was both loving and nurturing. Although my dad was a resident of Canada, his heart was always tugged back to Yorkshire. And fortunately, because of his work in the Oriental carpet industry, he was able to take my mum and us, his children, back most years to Yorkshire, where he would wander the moors with my mother like they did when they were newlyweds, while I whinged about the weather. For my dad, the late 1960s, 1970s, and 80s were paradise for him because all of us were healthy and the future was filled with optimistic prospects. For 35 years, life was good to my dad. But when he retired, the storms of illness and death began to gather around him and our family. The good times were coming to a rapid and horrible end. First, rheumatoid arthritis struck my mother with an unrelenting cruelty that left her disabled, diminished, and struggling to maintain her independence. Yet as my mum grew more ill, my dad didn't despair because his youth in the slums of Bradford had taught him that life is a brief affair that must begin and end in love to endure it. So he took care of her and built her a beautiful garden in their retirement home on a lake east of Toronto that had sunsets as brilliant as the ones that they had seen on their many trips to the Caribbean. He kept my mother going through singing songs to her, telling jokes, and trying to make the best of a bad situation. And just when my parents thought they were getting a handle on my mother's illness, my brother Peter became gravely ill with schizophrenia. He was in a desperate state because of his mental illness, and without my parents' gentle love for him and insistence that he come live with them, he would not have survived his disease. But these were dark days for my parents because mental illness is not kind or quiet or gentle, and it was a struggle to keep Pete on his meds because they had such a devastating effect on his body and soul. My dad wouldn't give up on my brother, and he kept him safe during those years when his mental illness was at its most extreme. My dad was the one who coaxed my brother to return to his vocation as an artist. My dad was the one that slept with Peter when it was feared he would do harm to himself. It was my dad that took him to a pub every week so he could feel part of humanity. It was my dad that kept the ship afloat when all around him had given up hope, my dad never surrendered 1 inch of love, compassion, humor, and decency when it came to taking care of both my brother and mother. And so, time passed, and my brother stabilized and was able to join with small steps the outside world. In May of 1999, Peter was well enough to marry the love of his life, Maria. But in July of 1999, my mum died quickly from cancer at the age of 70. Upon her death, the grief was intolerable for my dad, the sorrow so enormous that I feared for his survival. But as I was to learn in my dad's journals, it was Peter that kept him alive for the first few months after my mum died. You see, Peter still lived at home with him, and they kept each other company during the long nights of grief. And that should have been the end of the story. It should have ended with my brother getting older, me getting older, and my dad gently aging until death took him. But the natural order of events didn't happen for us because tragedy is the price we all must pay for being alive. And there are no sure bets for happiness in this world. What we least expected, what we hadn't anticipated or bargained for, was that in 2009, my charming, brilliant brother died horribly at the age of 50 from pulmonary fibrosis. It should not have happened, but it did. For both my dad and me, the clocks in our lives stopped the moment Peter died. The grief was pitch black, and we couldn't see our way out of it. We fled to Portugal, but there, all we heard in the roar of the tide against the beach near our rented home was our sadness over the death of a son and brother. I gradually came to realize that my dad was not going to survive Pete's death, and so I remembered what my mom had said to me a few days before she died. I am glad that I was able to give your father the love he needed to survive. I realized that if I wanted to help my dad endure his grief and not see his days end in anger, in sorrow, and in defeat, I had to give him all my love so that he could walk free from the chains of mourning that had shackled him since the death of my mother. That is how Harry's last stand was born. It was born in the sorrow and despair of Peter's death to give my dad purpose and relevance. Over that time, we traveled tens of thousands of miles through North America, Europe, and Britain so that he could speak to people younger than him about his fears that neoliberalism was leading the world back to the dark days of his youth. It was a rough and ready existence of hotels, trains, planes, and automobiles. Sometimes we ventured to his next speaking stop in good humor. Other times he grumbled that he felt that he was part of Fred Carnot's army. But he never wanted to stop doing the tours because many times I asked him if he wanted to stop, and he always replied, "We can't, because I owe the dead as well as the living my memories, until politicians and voters understand that the good life is for all of us, not just the self-entitled. Besides, what good would I be to you, to me, or anyone just watching television and watching my days trickle down to a precious few?" The last 10 years of my dad's life were hard, beautiful years. And because we were alone, we became more than father and son. We became partners, friends, and comrades. Our relationship, because of the work we did, the essays, the books that he wrote, the speaking tours we embarked on across Britain, made our relationship as strong and as profound as a good marriage. Over those years, we relied upon each other so much and trusted each other so much that I know that we both became better people because of our intense love for each other. In fact, when he was in the ICU this past November and realized that he wouldn't survive, his first words to me were, "Sorry, old son." During those bedtime stories my dad told me when I was a boy, he always came back to one memory that haunted him until his dying breath. It was about a recurring dream that he had when he was young and lived with his family in a cramped, rotting Doss house in Bradford. The Doss was overpopulated with other families made homeless by the Great Depression. There he slept in an unheated attic besides his dad, on a mattress rife with bugs, with a coat from St. Vincent de Paul as a blanket. And when he fell asleep in that horrible, unheated, unhealthy attic, he dreamed that he was a hawk flying above the city of Bradford. At first, the dream was joyous and liberating as he thought he had escaped his poverty below. But then as he tried to climb higher into the sky, he felt himself being tugged back down to the ground and saw that his claw had a chain locked around it that was fastened to the chimney pot on the roof of the Doss that he lived in. I thought about that dream as he lay dying in a hospital bed, as I held his hand and stroked his head. When his breath stopped and his nurse put a stethoscope to his chest and said in a quiet tone to me, "He's gone," I said, "Now you're free to soar far away from here, not like a hawk, but like the lark ascending into the gentleness of a blue sky." Never forget that my dad reveled in the joy of living, which is why his last words before morphine sent him into his last sleep were, "Enjoy yourself, because it's later than you think." What a life, what a legacy, what a responsibility for us that are left alive to continue to preserve what he and so many others from his generation did to build a better Britain. Because if we don't, my dad's past will most definitely become our future. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Like father, like son. That was a tremendous, heartfelt, generous, glorious tribute to your father, and we will honour his life, his legacy, and take the responsibility forward. Absolutely. It was just absolutely brilliant. Now, we have a short film. We're coming to the close, but we have a short film now, which is Harry in his own words. Thank you.
I am Harry Leslie Smith. I am the world's oldest rebel. I was born in 1923 in the coal mining town of Barnsley, Yorkshire. There's something in the genes. My father was a miner. He was injured in the mines, and he had no jobs, and there was no jobs even if you were healthy. But he was also an intelligent man. When I was a small boy, he would take me around and talk to me about history and also nature, about humanity. He was just a good father. My mother, too, she was a strict woman, but she had a difficult time because she was always battling the money problem. And I can tell you that my childhood, like so many others from that era, was not like an episode from Downton Abbey. Instead, it was a barbarous time. It was a bleak time, and it was an uncivilized time, because public health care didn't exist. No one in our community was safe from poor health, sickness and disease. In our home, TB came for my eldest sister, Marion. Tuberculosis tortured my sister and left her an invalid that had to be restrained with ropes tied around her bed. My parents did everything in their power to keep Marion alive and comfortable, but they just didn't have the dosh to get her the best clinics, find her the best doctors, or the right medicines. Instead, she wasted away before our eyes until my mother could no longer handle her care, and she was dispatched to the workhouse infirmary, where she died at the age of 10, 87 years ago. I am not a politician, a member of the elite, or a financial guru, but my life is your history, and we should keep it that way. So say it loud and say it clear in this hall and across this country. Keep your mitts off my NHS.
There was a stream of hundreds of thousands of refugees coming south. I can still see them. Absolute, pitiful, hungry, starving. When it was possible, we would stop and give them whatever excess food supplies we had on our trucks. And assure them that now they were safe. I think for the first time I saw a gleam of hope in their faces. I saw this woman who made my heart stumble and filled me with wonder. I thought, who is this woman? She's so... And I said aloud, you're beautiful. My love for her was sincere, that we would be a couple. I think she knew also for the rest of our lives. I felt like a king when I was with her. I felt like a movie star. She was so beautiful. After Britain struggled and endured the horrors and deprivations of the Second World War, we created a nation where no one was left vulnerable because of poverty, poor health, or substandard housing. We built a balanced and fair country that encouraged entrepreneurs, valued scientific discovery, and protected the workers from unfair labor practices.
For the next 40 years, it was good. It was extremely good. I brought my family up, I bought my house and garden, and I was able to take trips, and you know, as soon as Lady Thatcher took over, it was a downhill from there on. 2008, the banking crisis, that angered me to such an extent that I thought that these banks could be acted so criminally and yet pay no price. And the public taxes were used to bail the banks out. I was so angry because it wasn't just England, it was every Western nation had collapsed because of it. 2013. I'd written a book, Harry's Last Stand, and the book became so popular because of the way it was written and what it was written about. My name became well known, and I'm using it further better living standards for all. We shouldn't have any trouble with paying for health care. My God, that's so ridiculous. I know I'm not a historian, but I am history, and I fear its repetition.
It's why I support all those that are taking a stand against the rise of fascism in the 21st century. The present and the past seem to collide in my mind these days because there is so much happening now that reminds me of long ago. On the back of that army truck, I was overcome by the sheer joy of survival. It's quite an overwhelming feeling to know that you have survived both the Great Depression and the Second World War. I knew I had a chance to live, to become an old man. But when I saw refugees clutching their scant possessions, marching away from the war, I couldn't help but feel connected to them. All of us are connected as human beings. The refugee, the homeless person, the young mother having to use the food bank, the working family trying to make do on low wages, the pensioner without savings, are all products of one political system.
I think all our current problems share one common element with my early life, and that is there's too much wealth held in too few hands. This type of inequity shouldn't occur anymore.
Because you are worth more than flat wages. You are worth more than eternal austerity. You are worth more than hard Brexit. You are worth more than student debt and 0-hour contracts. You are worth more than the greed of the 1% and the incompetence of the Tories. Within you is the blood of your grandparents and great-grandparents that sacrificed their lives on the battlefields of Europe and Asia. Within you is the DNA of all your ancestors who fought for the rights of women to vote. Within you is the echo of all those who battled for their right to an NHS that provided health care to all, not just the well-to-do. Within you is the spark to become the greatest generation of the 21st century. So I ask you, as a very old man who has seen Britain at its worst and greatest, to stand strong and send the Tories packing, because you deserve a future that has hope, prosperity, and purpose. But let's leave it there for now, because it's time to end this episode and let you catch your breath. Ta-ra.
Harry Leslie Smith, what a man, what a man, what a man. It's why we miss him, but we will continue to be inspired by him. And I just spy at the back a rebel-to-rebel personal tribute, John McDonnell, Labour's Shadow Chancellor. Thank you for coming along to pay your respects. Dude. A great man. All right. We're going to close now, and I've been terrified about this after we murdered Danny Boy. Well, we're going to finish with some singing, and of course, a proud Yorkshire-born socialist like Harry would want us to sing On Ilk Lemur Batat and the Red Flag. The words are on your chairs. I hope somebody knows when to start the singing this time. But last night, the Unite Brass Band met in Sheffield to pay their tribute, to record their tribute. So we will see them on the screen, we will hear them on the screen. Well, let's sing our hearts out for Harry. Look, all the speakers have gone. Where'd go? Come on. Come on, let's be honest, we were rubbish. Let's have better luck with a red flag. Well, I think we just about redeemed ourselves with that singing, just about. Harry liked the song. I'm not sure he'd have liked all of our singing, but on your way out, there's a collection for Care for Calais, the refugee charity which Harry supported. Please put in the bucket whatever you can afford. John is going to go wherever he's gone there next week. I'd like to thank all the stewards. I'd like to thank the harpist, Allegra Mullaney. I'd like to thank the Unite Brass Band, glad they couldn't hear us. Conway Hall, Unite, all the speakers, particularly John, everybody here and everybody at home. It's been a fantastic, fantastic night. I stand with Harry, you stand with Harry, we all stand with Harry. A rebel we'll always remember. Thank you very much. Safe home. Thank you.